1, 2, 3, 4.
All right, attempt number 2. So internationalization and localization. First, this is it sounds like an easy topic, but it actually gets pretty interesting. Quickly, who I am, I run a company, started a company named Jumpstart Lab. You might have heard of a project we recently finished called Hungry Academy in partnership with Living Social, where we took 24 novices and turned them into developers over the course of 5 months. And they're now all working at Living Social as full-time engineers, one of whom even Andy has to be in charge of, who presented yesterday. Now, our new project is similar. It's called G School. It's going to take place in Denver, Colorado, and it's an open enrollment program. So any of you, if you were interested, if like maybe you're still just getting started with development, you could come enroll, hang out in Denver, Colorado with us for 6 months, do some snowboarding, and also learn some Ruby. If you're interested in that, check it out. Talk to me on Twitter afterwards here. But briefly, an aside about kind of my thinking when I first heard about this getting accepted to the conference. I had to kind of guilt my way in. First, Steve got accepted first. And I say, how come Steve always gets accepted first? Steve gets invited, and I always have to apply for things. But then I got in, and I was like, yes, RubyConf Argentina. Happy Jeff was excited, and skeptical Jeff was like, oh, go to Argentina and present in English? That seems like kind of a dick move. And then I was like, what should I do? I studied Spanish for 6 years. But if I'm in English, like, are people going to understand my jokes? And then skeptical Jeff realized Spanish might not work at all. So better 90% in English than possibly 0% in Spanish. So apologies. I hope that works for you all. What I want to tell you about is kind of a dangerous journey, the process of internationalizing and localizing an application. If you ever travel to Los Angeles, I suggest you check out the La Brea Tar Pits, our fascinating museum there, where there's a trove of fossils there, and all these animals that were preserved from ancient times when they were just taking a pleasant walk along, and then they're like, hey, what's up with this black lake? And then they went to take a step in it, and then pretty soon their family elephants are off on the side like, oh no, you're dead. Sorry. And that's kind of how internationalization and localization goes. You're like, this is not so bad. I can just extract a couple keys, everything will be cool, and then all of a sudden, you're a fossil. Okay, so 2 terms to get out of the way. Because I think much like authentication and authorization, those 2 terms are so similar and they get switched up quite a bit. Let's talk about internationalization versus localization. Internationalization is a one-time process. It's taking an application that only supports one language and preparing it to support multiple languages. On the other hand, localization is once you have an internationalized app, localization is creating a locale, creating a collection of strings and other data relevant to a certain language. Okay? So they fit together. Why business cares about these things, right? First off, localization provides a much better user experience. Obviously, to your users, I'm sure I don't have to tell you all that, especially if you're significantly more comfortable in Spanish than using an all-English app. You can probably get what you want to get done, but it's not as pleasant as if it were localized for you. The better user experience you have in general, the more customers, and presuming a big presumption that you actually make money, the more customers you have, the more profits you'll make, unlike Facebook. I guess more, but they need 1 billion more customers to make like $1. So you're a developer, maybe you're not the business owner, and you care about code, you don't really care about profits as long as you have a job, like you're most interested in programming. So why get involved in this tar pit? And the answer is that internationalization actually results in better code. It's not just an annoying problem that you solve once your product exits beta. It helps you get there. It helps you write a better application along the way. There are 3 key steps that we're going to go over. First, how to internationalize. Second, then how to localize. And third, the part that's most interesting to me is once you have those pieces in place, figuring out what locale do you serve to a user. So first, internationalizing is about carving up your application. One of the reasons I think this topic is under-discussed in the Rails community is that it's very easy to put off. You can say like, yeah, we're gonna support multiple languages once we hit 1.0, which never happens, right? So you just put it off. But if you attack it early, it's actually pretty easy to work with. This is a common-looking Rails controller. Anyone ever written one that looked like this? Okay, I've written millions, it seems like. Okay, there's nothing essentially wrong here, but there kind of is when maybe it's, I think probably more common here, but in the US, I'm kind of an outcast in the Ruby community because I got a degree in computer science and not like professional saxophone or whatever. When I was studying computer science, one of my professors would talk about magic data, and you'd say like, yes, magic is good. And he would say, no, magic is very bad. And in the Rails world, there's always this term, magic, comes up, and I always try and push back against it. Like Steve and I like to say like, magic is just code you don't understand yet, right? But magic data is actually something really bad. And one of the reasons it's bad is it leads to what I call copy edit commits, where in the middle of your code, in the middle of your application logic, you have these commits that are just changing a word here and there. And words in your strings, words that don't affect the functionality of the application, they affect the user experience, they affect what the user is going to see on the screen. The reason that's a problem is because developers don't pay much attention to it. You get an email from your client that says like, oh, instead of saying you are not logged in, we want it to say you aren't logged in. Like, oh my God, you email me about this, okay, whatever. So you're very lazy, right? As we are, you've probably got your whole browser and email like all keyboard driven. You're like Vim keyboard shortcutting around your email. You copy and paste, you aren't logged in. You go into your code, you paste it in, you're like, I don't need to run the test for this, just ship it. And then you get it up there and you realize one of two things happened. Either, let's step back. Either the string that you had in the first place was single quote delimited, and now you've got like single quote, DON, single quote, boom, everything blows up. Or better yet, they've used, of course, because they were writing words, they needed to use what program? Word. And it couldn't just give you a normal quote, it had to give you a quote with a little flavor to it, now blown up your application. Two possibilities, right? And so this stuff is not only annoying, it's dangerous, okay? So how can you get that stuff out of your functional code? These two pieces of magic data are the parts that can be isolated through internationalization. The way you could do that, there we go, is by means of a lookup dictionary. So Rails out of the box supports lookup dictionaries. There is pre-generated an English one already that just has a single key in it. But once you develop the dictionary, it could look a little bit like this. Uses YAML, which back in 2005, when we were all writing XML coming from the Java world, we're like, YAML, yeah, this is so much better. Now in 2012, I think YAML's not cool anymore. If Rails were being invented today, these dictionaries would probably be handled as hashes or as JSON, but it's kind of a historical artifact. This is one of the only two places that you'll encounter YAML in Rails. So YAML structure, you have the locale itself up here as the top level key, and then under that you have a nested hash, in this case 2 keys, article and comment. Article has a nested hash underneath it with 6 nested keys, and each of those points to a string. The beauty of this is that it takes very little explaining to a translator, to a copy editor, to a business person, how to manipulate this file. If you can convince them, please God, don't put tabs in here, just hit space and everything will be cool, and they don't import it into Microsoft Word. If you can set them up with some Sublime Text or TextMate or Notepad++ or whatever, you can generally get this done. Once you define those keys, you use them most commonly with just the T helper available to you in Rails views and Rails controllers, a convenient shortcut. So this would be a one level of nesting, so the article parent hash and then a subkey deleted. You could also go with multiple levels of nesting. like that. You can have infinity levels of nesting, and you'll think that's pretty cute until you start having to write those strings everywhere. And finally, if you're not in a controller or view context, you can talk, instead of using the shortcut of just T, you can say I18N, which is the internationalization library, .T, give it the key. Chances are that you would do this from a model, and if you do this, do it with great reservation, because you're probably doing it in a place that's not appropriate. If you're translating things at a model layer, that's probably a sign that it doesn't belong there, because translation should be a view-level concern. So you want to push that up somewhere. One of the few times I'll say to push things up the stack, kind of up to a controller, up to a view template. So then how do you structure keys? People try and get cute because we're programmers, right? And so you hate repetition, you love to be lazy, you start looking at those keys and you see all these opportunities, like, this looks so easy, anyone could manipulate it, let me screw it up. Like, I have to maintain my job, and I'll start making this stuff complicated. Another lazy approach is to just take the words that the string says, like the article was not saved, and then to make a key that's the underscore article underscore key, blah, 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 blah. Snake casing the text, and that's very ineffective, because what happens eventually is you change the string, and now you have a mismatch between the key and the string, and it gets confusing. Instead, focus on the core meaning and screw reusability. Like, as much as possible, resist the urge to say, like, oh, this fragment of this key, and like, comment was not saved, and article was not saved. I don't want to write was not saved twice. I'm gonna like inject it here. Regret. Future self will hate past self, okay? As they usually do. So keep your strings, your keys really, really simple. As you can see, like here, English, article, created, and now if we change this to say, article was created successfully, article has been created, blah, 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 the core idea of article created is gonna remain. Okay, so keep those keys really short and simple. Now, an aside, if you find yourself needing some complexity up at the view layer and you say to yourself, man, I wish I had a Ruby object right now, boom, you have a gem written by me and this weirdo. He's not even paying attention, it's okay. Back on track. Yeah, you. I've seen this talk 3 times already. No, it's all fresh. Back in this land, okay, the transition is simple. Now, instead of having those strings embedded, we rip it out, use the T helper, and use these simple keys to look up the data from the dictionary. So that's at the controller level. Now, down at the model level, you get to use some active record. Some might say magic, but I prefer to say genius from the man, Aaron Patterson. Everything that works in active record, I always credit Aaron Patterson, because he's like the only one who understands how it all is put together. Down in a model, you might have multiple pieces of magic data. And the way I identify magic data is pretty much any string or integer that has domain meaning, right? So like this 10 right here is magic data because it looks like just the number 1 and the number 0, but what it means is how many articles are considered recent, right? And it's bad because it doesn't express that meaning unless you understand the whole context. Instead, this should be extracted at least to a constant and maybe even to a localization key. You can put integers in your keys. The one I'm going to focus on, though, is right here. With validations in Active Record will do automatic lookups in your translation file, in your lookup dictionary. It uses this complicated explanation. The Rails guides around this stuff, they cover everything, but they're a little bit hard to follow. If this is a topic you're interested in, I recommend maybe you talk to Steve or talk to the Rails docs team and try and polish it up a little bit. This is the chain that Active Record will go through to look up translations. And what that means, it's going to need, for a given validation, you need to know exactly what key it's looking for. And unfortunately, the keys mapping the keys to the name of the validation is a little bit tricky. So there's this table in the Rails guide that every time you want to use it, you're going to have to pull up the Rails guide, at least if you're dumb like me. In case here we're interested in presence, and you find that the message key for it is blank. What that means is that if you structure your keys in this style, it has to be exactly this way. Active record, errors, models, article, attributes, title, blank. No problem, right? This string will get used for errors on that validation automatically. Okay? So what that means is in the model, this string can now go away. One fewer piece of magic data in our model. To show it off in the console, create a new article. It has no title, right? So you try and save it. You get back false. You inspect it, and you'll see that the error message is there from the validation. What you get back as an error is a tuple, the name of the attribute, and the string. I have spent some time trying to cutely inject this into the middle of a message, and it goes back to that previous lesson of, I would say, just forget this part. When you're doing output to the user, just output the message. Make your message work without anything else. Just grab that last piece. That's just for the messages. When it comes to forms, if you're using the label helper, as I hope you are, if you set up keys in this style under the attributes subhash, Rails will automatically use these when it labels your form elements. Okay? So for instance, with comment here, instead of saying body of the comment to the user, that doesn't mean anything. That's like my database term. Instead, on the form, I want it labeled your comment. Yeah. Putting those pieces together might look kind of like this. Okay? Extracting those strings out of your code makes for better code, makes it easier to maintain, makes it less likely to change. Step 2, dealing with user content. This is where it starts to get pretty tricky. Dealing with this stuff is easy. It's just the YAML file. You can email it around, whatever you have to. You could maybe put in a Google Doc if you had to. Getting it in and out of your app is relatively easy. But with user-generated content, things start to get really difficult. Your data's in the database. You know what I'm talking about? Like, say you're running a news site, you've got your articles, and those articles have titles and bodies and so forth. How are you going to deal with this? Creating the translations of that content is complicated, of course. Like, you probably, if you're going to support locales, you're probably supporting more than 1 or 2. It's probably like 4 or 5. And so everything you create is now going to have to get distributed for translation to multiple translators. You're going to have to manage the input and output of that data. But then the really horrifying part is keeping those translations in sync. Right? Because you've sent out the data for translation, and somebody's going to miss the deadline. Now you get 4 translations back, and 1 is still lagging. Or you send it out for translation, the original author makes an edit. Now you're trying to keep track. Did I send you the version 1, or was it version 1 final, or was it version 1 final? Okay. One option is Copycopter. This came out of Thoughtbot in Boston. It was a paid service at first. I think they found that no one was willing to pay for it, and so they have made it an open source project that you can now run on your own. It works through rake tasks and allows you to basically move your content data off to another place and kind of sync it up between the 2 apps. It's interesting to experiment with. Maybe a pure open source approach running right in your app is Globalize 3. What this will do is create sub-tables. Well, they're full database tables, but basically, conceptually, they're child tables to each of your elements. Watching this lady have to translate me is hilarious. I'm sorry. I apologize to you. Sorry, Globalize. For every database table, you're creating multiple child tables, and the complexity of your app really ramps up a little bit, and so I don't love this approach. And while I have no affiliation with these people, once I saw this third-party app called Locale App, I said to myself, like, I will never attempt to do this on my own again. This is pretty amazing. It's a paid service. They have a nice plugin, hooks up to your code, and basically does all the hard part for you. I believe it even supports like hiring people Mechanical Turk style to do the translations and so forth. So it's like, it's one of those things where you're like, we can handle this translation stuff. And then after you've screwed it up for a couple hundred hours, you're like, maybe we should have paid someone instead of bombing all our time into it. And so I would strongly recommend you check this out if you're interested in this. So then step 3, how do you figure out what the user actually wants? This is where we get into some code. And although Steve said, I've seen this talk like 26 times already, completely untrue as of now. Because I had a bunch of code in here, and I think probably like most people when they write code for a presentation, I was just slinging some code. I wasn't testing anything. I don't know if I even built a test app. But for you, good people, I wanted to do better. And I said, all right, I've got a little bit of time. I've got all this code. Let me just write some tests and make sure it actually works. And the funny thing about it, so because we teach programming, I have to fight the battle over TDD and BDD on an almost daily basis. My code works. I can just click on it. And I say like, yeah, okay, kind of. But you're really missing the beauty of the BDD. I don't care for the name BDD because behavior doesn't really mean anything to me, especially when it's spelled in British English. I prefer to call it dream-driven development, which is really the same meaning. I try and write a test or a spec that expresses how I wish things were, and then I just make them that way. And thanks to Ruby, pretty much whatever I dream comes true. Now, the funny thing about this, I had the code written. I'm looking at my old presentation, writing the specs for the code. And the code that I wrote to fulfill the specs came out completely different, which was just fast. It was like not really purposeful. I knew I was making it a little bit better along the way, but it actually turned out so dramatically better that I feel guilty that I showed other people the old code. Okay, so now the trick of it is that through the BDD process, I was able to modularize a bunch of things, both in literal modules and just conceptually to break them apart. So I'm going to try and show you different pieces and how they fit together, although, of course, there's a pretty small limitation on how much code you can fit on a slide. So I just made it really small. No, just kidding. This is all put together in a gem that I released yesterday called Locale Setter. And if you have an application, especially one that isn't mission critical, I would love for you to try this out and give me some feedback. So here's how it goes. We're going to talk about a few different strategies for locating people. Did they have Carmen Sandiego in Argentina? Okay, thank God. It wouldn't make sense otherwise. I feel like she was always in Buenos Aires, hiding out. Okay, first strategy, geolocation. Don't use it, it's horrible. End. Strategy number 2, browser. No, but it is true, right? Like, if I go on, it's very annoying to me that on my own laptop, I'm at the hotel, I pull up something on Google, and it's like, oh, would you like to go to google.ar? No, like, I get it. I don't speak Spanish that well, man. Just give me a break, Google. Like, you know me, I'm logged in. Just because I'm in Argentina, like maybe I'm feeling the flavor of Argentina, and I want that. It's very unlikely that location closely correlates to language preference, especially in the States, where we have great depth of different languages spoken. So don't use geolocation. Maybe as a very last resort, 6th to last resort kind of situation. Browser preferences is pretty interesting. If in a view template, you were to use the debug helper and output request.env, you would see this beautiful thing, and then you go, the answer is right before me. You don't see it? Okay, it's right there. HTTP accept language. And if you were listening this morning about REST, or you've seen Steve ever talk about HTTP, you will find that some people believe that HTTP can solve all your problems. Win too, I guess. We just put status codes on it, everything will be cool. Now, I actually agree with you, right? There's all this depth and kind of beauty in HTTP that we don't take advantage of, and this is one that people often overlook. If you were to pull out request env HTTP accept language on a request, you might see a string like this. Just by the way, if you're kind of new to Rails or not familiar with this technique, this is one of my favorite little experimenting techniques. If you're in a controller, you can call render, give it the key text, and pass in any string, and what you get back is just that raw string, as opposed to doing like raise or something like that and kind of aborting your call chain. It's a nice way to just find out little pieces of information. How am I doing on time? Plenty? Okay. 2 hours? Got it. No problem.
3 more minutes.
Really? Yeah. Oh, shit. Okay. All right. So you got this string. And you can understand what it is. I need to pick up some time. No, just kidding. Right? So it's kind of confusing because it's constructed by nerds or that maybe didn't have a lingual skills or something. The comma is the primary delimiter here, whereas the semicolon is the secondary delimiter, which is the reverse of how it should be. Okay? You break these three apart, and what these are saying is that I would prefer US English, and then I'm going to understand everything that's going on. Generic English, you start talking about lifts and torches and behavior and color, I'm going to understand 80% of what you're talking about. And unfortunately, as my hotel restaurant can testify, at Spanish, I'm going to get about 20%, and I'm going to just say gracias a lot. If you wanted to parse that accept language, just hacking around, I came up with some regular expression, so you can guarantee that this mostly works, and comes out like that. But then in a TDD approach, it came out with something a little bit more complicated, but it's got more modules in it, so you know it must be cooler. We got module, 3 modules deep, doing a bunch of splitting and so forth, and you can pull out those fragments. Sorry, I have to kind of hit the gas here. So if you ask i18n, the library, it'll tell you what locales are available, and if you know which locales they've requested, you can match those. Right? It sounds easy. There's a little nuance to it in that you need to find the ones they want, find the ones you have. The list is maintained internally as symbols. What you get in from them are strings. So you need to symbolize their strings, compare those with the supported locales, and then finally, of course, find the first match in order of their preference, not in the order of your supported locales. In Ruby, in principle, this is easy. People don't often use the single ampersand, which is the intersection of 2 sets. So if I have their requested locales intersect that with the available locales, I'm going to get back a collection, which is the elements common to both sets. Ordered preference goes to the first one, and then I'm going to grab the first element of that set. Sounds easy. Okay, next approach, URL parameters. This one is super useful. When people implement, you can find many rack middleware and so forth that implement the last approach. For some reason, people don't pursue this one very much. It's incredibly useful to be able to manipulate the locale in your URL. If you're debugging, whether as a developer or a designer, especially as a designer, it's critically awesome to be able to just switch locales without having to dig into browser preferences, etc. There's also this argument I found online about users wanting to copy and paste links and share them to their friends, and it should be in the same language they were seeing. I'm not sure. I think that varies a little bit by domain. So you could do something really simple like this. i18 locales, params locale, no problem. Why do I need a gem? Boom. Danger time. Okay? Did you know you can query for all symbols defined in your runtime? Symbol, all symbols. This gives you back an enormous collection, 6,000 symbols if you're running Rails. That's not made up, actually 6,000. Say you set your locale to some input parameter that a user gave you. It comes in as a string, it gets symbolized, added to your symbol table. Now what's the problem? You've exposed yourself to a denial of service attack here, albeit somewhat obscure, but because symbols are never garbage collected, I, for instance, or my friend Brian Lyles, who likes to crash people's apps, he could just spam you with iterating through locale requests, just junk strings, until you run out of memory, everything goes down, and then of course it crashes, it boots back up, and everything looks fine. And you're like, oh, the hiccup. I'll blame EC2. Okay, how many I got? Can I skip questions?
Yes.
Okay, so I got 7?
Yeah.
Yes. You can ask me questions at lunch. So you can pull out those parameters, and then the interesting part here is to pass it into this matcher bit, which is going to make sure that it's valid before symbolizing it. So if you see here, I'm passing in params locale, which has come in as just the string version from params. Okay, so the string is coming in here, and then in matcher, instead of the simple version before, down here, what I'm going to do is stringify the available locales, because those are safe, right? So they're maintained internally as symbols. I stringify them, and then do my comparison here, string to string. Grab the first string that matched, so now I know at this point that it's safe. If it matched here, it had to be known here, which meant it was one of my available locales, then to sim it. Okay, and just like that, block the denial of service attack. So you do all that work, you get this locale in your URL, everything's awesome, then you click a link and it disappears. Oh my gosh. Okay, no problem, you can fix this. Rails has a built-in functionality for you called default URL options. It takes a hash of options, and you can manipulate URLs that are generated. So assuming that in your view templates you're using URL helpers and not using like A tags, which you shouldn't, please don't. One of the reasons to always use URL helpers is to take advantage of features like this. So by defining default URL options, we can inject options to every link that Rails renders on the page. What this has done here is said, all right, if they're in the default locale, whether they put it on manually or whatever, I'm just going to remove it. There's no sense in kind of junking up my URLs unnecessarily. But if they're in any locale other than the default, just merge that onto the passed-in URL options. And the order here is a little bit careful so that if for some reason somewhere else you were setting the locale, like you were making links that were like, see this in Spanish, see this in English, see this in German, then that would override this because the merge is happening onto it, so it would override this. User preferences. Okay, it would be great, as I was explaining with Google, I wish they tracked my user preference more tightly and they would just always show me English. You could just add a column to the database, maybe locale string, and then in locale setter, what we do is check, do you have a current user? Well, do you have a method current user? Like, do you have authentication in your app? Is there a currently logged in user? If both of those, then let's try and get the locale for that current user. And then with that logged in user, so this is a user object that exists, we see, do they have a locale column or another method that somehow computes their locale? If they do, and it returns a value, and that value is not empty, right? So we've covered the column not existing, the column being nil or null, and the column being an empty string. If it's not any of those things, so it is some string, then attempt to match it here. And the beauty here is that with reusing that match from before, we still have all the guards against, like, what if they somehow manipulate their locale to some invalid string? Or what if they have an old locale, they were a user from 2 years ago, and since then we've removed their locale, it's not going to crash, it's just going to fall back to the default. Okay, so putting these pieces all together. P.S. There's a great movie about Tetris. If you like Tetris, like I do, watch this documentary. Like, just say you have to fly 13 hours to a conference, you have time for some movies. So let's put together this chain. First, URL parameter. If there is a URL parameter, I want it to override everything else. That's going to allow a logged-in user to manipulate their locale. Second, user preference. Third, the HTTP browser settings. And fourth, just drop back to the default. So because of the simple construction from BDD, putting these pieces together actually becomes very easy, where it just becomes OR statements excuse me, between params, user, HTTP, and then default, and then these three little proxy methods that say, all right, if you want to get it from a user, call this, if you've got a user, and all that. Okay. I know that was super fast. I'll let you dig through this code more later if you'd like to check it out. Casimir locale setter. Bonus round. Whiteboxing an IETN, stacking $100 bills. That was one of the most confusing things to me when I got here. I had done no research whatsoever, and I went to the ATM and it offered me dollars, US dollars, and I was like, what? And then someone explained it to me for like half an hour. I kind of understood. you have something like this, okay? These are just strings. Internationalization and localization manipulate strings. So you could take that and instead replace it with calls to T. What would that allow you to do? You could now implement multiple locales that are client 1 and client 2. You could use this as a very simple way to skin an app, run one instance, maybe just say on a free Heroku, and you could bill 2 clients for the exact same code. And then pile up your money. Okay, recap, internationalize, cut out all the strings, improve your code base. Second step, please give these people some money because their product is amazing. Third, figure out where you are, figure out where your user is, do it yourself with danger. It's a little more complicated than it seems. Use my gem. Try using ATN in unexpected ways, and that's it. My name is Jeff Casimir. My company is Jumpstart Lab. We teach the best Ruby and Rails classes on Earth. Thank you.